Hello and welcome to the latest episode of our podcast series. My name is Kenneally and I am historian in residence with Westmeath County Council. Today's episode is related to a new online exhibition, Everest1921.com, created by myself, which commemorates the 1921 Reconnaissance mission to Mount Everest, led by Charles Howard Bury, who grew up in Charleville Castle in County Offaly and who spent most of his life indeed, at Belvedere House and Gardens in County Westmeath, not far from Mullingar. My guest today is Frank Nugent, historian and renowned mountaineer who was deputy leader of the Irish expedition to Mount Everest in 1993, in which Dawson Stelfox reached the summit of the world's highest mountain. Now, Frank has written many works and covered many aspects of mountaineering history, including the story of Charles Howard Bury and the 1921 Reconnaissance mission, and he proves to be an excellent guide to the subject. We won't be talking about Howard Bury's life outside of the expedition. That is well covered in the online exhibition, Everest1921.com. Today we'll be sticking with the reconnaissance mission itself, how it came about, what it entailed and what it achieved. So, Frank, we're looking at the situation in 1921 and the decades beforehand, and at this time global exploration is bound up in the rivalry between the great powers, and the British have been beaten to both poles, north and south, and now exploration groups in Britain such as the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club, they're looking for new opportunities and what they call the third pole. Can you explain?
Well, I think you have to understand that the British had been really highly involved with trying to get to both poles first. They had many expeditions, and they certainly thought that Captain Scott would be first to reach the South Pole. And of course, he was beaten there by Roald Amundsen by about a month. And and Scott had already been in receipt of a Founder's Medal from the Royal Geographical Society. So when it was reported, was a couple of reports of a couple of different Americans having reached the North Pole. So as Everest was within India, was sort of within close to British territories. They thought that they would have that they actually identified Everest as the sort of third pole, and they put a lot of effort into trying to become the first to reach the summit of Everest. But of course, the big job first of all they had to do was find out how to get to the base of it. So, but they had the upper hand in the sense that they had mapped India and they had identified all of the chain of the Himalaya, and they had they were part of the Indian survey. Essentially reported back to the Royal Geographical Society, who incidentally they had the cheat to name Everest after one of their own, instead of usually apportioning the name to whatever the local name for a peak was. So there was a lot of vested interest in the British in pursuit of trying to make a first ascent of Everest.
And this is where Charles Howard Bury enters the scene. He had a particularly strong background in exploration, and is that how he came to lead the expedition in 1921? Yeah,
because when he went through, he went to Eton and on to Sandhurst, and then he commissioned out of Sandhurst a captain, and he was assigned to the Indian Rifles, and he spent his early army years in India. And as anytime he took leave or furlough out of the army, he went travelling up into one stage to Tibet, another stage he went to the Karakoram, and he went on various expeditions to different parts. And then when he left the army, he went to Hindu Kush. So he went to the Silk Road, Tien Shan, and so he had a great interest in everything Asian, all the Eastern religions and all of that culture. And of course, he was very into the languages. So he was an expert, if you like, in that part of the world. He had developed that expertise, and he was, if you like, through writing to the RGS, he made it obvious to him that he was prepared to do reconnaissance work at his own cost, So that was an invaluable somebody with his abilities and experience. He knew the military side as well as the exploration side, and then he had the languages, and obviously he'd come through the war, and he'd fought in all the great battles on the Western Front, and he'd come through. He was decorated. He was an obvious leader of men, and a very competent, capable, fella who was willing and able. I think his willingness and his ability, with those two things together, make anybody very, very suitable for a task like that.
Okay, so the situation as regard to Mount Everest at this time is that very little is known about the mountain, apart from its place as the world's highest peak. It is unmapped, and so is the whole region around the mountain. Tibet is an independent country. It had recently expelled Chinese forces. It had been attacked by the British Empire in 1903 and 1904, primarily 1904, but it had now had a working relationship with the British Empire and with the British government in India. And it was through that the expedition was given permission to enter Tibet. But Frank, could you explain the goals of what was called the Reconnaissance mission to Mount Everest?
Yeah, well, the big thing was, the key thing was to finding the base of the mountain and finding the key access route up. But they had set themselves the sub-tasks of mapping Sikkim and resurveying parts of Sikkim that hadn't been mapped. And they also wanted a map of Tibet up to the base of Everest. So they wanted an accurate map of that. So they immediately, before even the main expedition party set out, the party to map Sikkim left a couple of weeks previous. And then it was a question of actually for a survey team, it's generally a surveyor plus a couple of assistants. And it's a lot of heavy gear that has to be, and you have to climb to the top of peaks, and they got to find places where they could plant their theodolites and spot all the high points in the distance, etc. All of that. So they had already had experienced mappers from the Indian survey. So then they had to basically equip them with food and mules and whatever. So one team set out to do that. Then a second team set out to map the rest of Sikkim and Tibet. And then the most important map then was the 1-inch map of the immediate environs of Everest, which would be the mountains, the mountain chain itself. And there were two main people for that. And of course, Wheeler and Moorehead, they were the main people to do that.
So the situation is, it's mid-May 1921. They're in Darjeeling in Sikkim in northern India, and the expedition is about to begin. Could you chart that journey for us as they move from India into Tibet and towards Everest?
The expedition consisted of surveyors and climbers, and they rendezvoused in Darjeeling. They met, and Howard Bury had organised 100 mules and muleteers, and he'd also organised he'd about 30 bhotias, what we now call Sherpas. But he had got advice from the officer in Bell in Tibet that if he was going to hire locals, to hire these Sherpas from Nepal. So he organised, but they all met at Darjeeling, and then they proceeded to work their way through Sikkim. You have to go over a high pass, the Jelly Pass, and it's over 14,000 feet. So that's a huge, and then you've got to drop about 5,000 feet, and then through dense forestry and really beautiful countryside. And because Howard Bury was a botanist, he really enjoyed all this, and his notes and his diaries from all that, his reports back, illustrates just how much he was at home doing all that. But it was hard work. The mules they got from the British Army in India were useless. So we spent half of the journey, every village he went to, hiring local mules, replacing the mules they got. So he had an awful job. Now, it turned out that Callis, who was one of the very experienced climbers, he got sick. He had just come from climbing other mountains and he hadn't had time to rest and recover. And he suffered very severely from altitude sickness and he ended up being carried from camp to camp. And eventually he actually died just as they were, I suppose, reaching the borders with Tibet. And they had to bury him there. So, and also their other very senior climber, a Scotsman, Rayburn, he was also sick and they sent him back to rehabilitate for a few weeks to get his, he was suffering from altitude. So it didn't look great at the start.
Okay, so they're in Tibet and they're at Mount Everest, and you have Wheeler and Morsehead, they're the mapping team. Howard Bury is overseeing and directing the whole expedition. You have the climbing team. That was originally 4 members, but Rayburn had to return through illness to Sikkim in India. And Kellis, of course, he died, as you explained, en route. So that leaves Mallory, George Leigh Mallory, who would become famous in 1924 for his death on the mountain and all the speculation about whether he reached the top or not, and along with Andrew Irvine. And then alongside Mallory in 1921, you have Guy Bullock, and they're the climbing team. But I don't think they had much experience of going above 5,000 metres. Is that the case?
People like Mallory, when they went to the Alps, the highest altitude they would climb in the Alps would be Mont Blanc. So they were used to being able to climb up to, say, 4,800. So 5,000 metres was, they knew that could climb up to that. But when you went over 5,000, because the Everest Base Camp is at the height of, it's around 5,000 metres. So that's sort of, more or less the top of Mont Blanc. But when you try to climb higher, you're on 50% less oxygen than you would be at sea level. So obviously your mind your brain doesn't work that well. Everything is slower. You get cold. And it wasn't known for sure if you could actually survive at that sort of altitude. So there was all sorts of experiments going on, and a lot of scientists reckoned that you needed supplementary oxygen in order to safely climb it and that. And indeed, the Callis on the first expedition, he was an expert in this, and he was experimenting in oxygen systems and kits for climbing in the Himalayas. So there was a good bit of knowledge about it. But nowadays, it's very, very dangerous for someone to be any more than, say, 24 hours over 8,000 metres. And my own experience of being up on mountains, I noticed when I've been over 8,000 metres a couple of times, and I noticed that if you take off the oxygen mask, the colours diminish. You don't think as quick. You move slowly, because there's less oxygen to your brain, and everything just seems to happen slower. And the sharpness is things go out of focus a bit, and so you don't perform. So in order to climb Everest without oxygen, you really would want to have been living and operating at high level to get yourself acclimatized to be able to operate.
So they are working at over 5,000, often well over 6,000 metres, camped at those altitudes, and they have to deal with often very hazardous weather conditions: cold, snow, ice, high winds, wind chill. What kind of clothing did they have to survive and to combat those conditions?
If you look at a photograph of the 1921 expedition, you see they're all dressed in tweeds and whatever. And indeed, I think it was George Bernard Shaw, when he saw the picture, he thought it was like a picnic in Connemara rather than on the side of Everest. So the gear, now the only thing about that is the gear, that sort of clothing actually works very well. This is the warmest clothing you could wear. Now, what they didn't have was the breathable fabrics that we would have nowadays. But what they did have was the best of the time. And they'd learned a lot from the guys who went to the poles. And the windproof anorak was really the the thing they didn't have as well as they might. They still were very much into the tweeds.
Well, it's good to hear that they were suitably dressed for the occasion, and they needed to be, obviously, given the conditions in which they were working. And around the 20th of September, they reached an area called the North Col, which turned out to be vital to the outcome of the mission. Can you explain the significance of that in terms of mountaineering, in terms of reaching the summit of Mount Everest, and in terms of what they were actually trying to achieve?
Well, what happened was they were trying to find a route, but if you look from a distance, you could see the ridge that was coming down, the northeast ridge. It looked like a line that was very climbable from a distance. And the way to get onto it, there's one mountain called Changxi. They called it the North Peak of Everest. So between Changxi and that northeast ridge is a col, like a saddle on a mountain. And that is now known as the North Col, or in Tibetan it's the Chang La. Getting onto the Chang La was the key, but when they got up onto it, as soon as they actually reached the col, they were blown out of it with gales and winds, and the weather was totally unfavourable. So they weren't able to go any much higher than that. Now, Mallory would have loved to have gone up further up the ridge, but the weather just didn't allow them. But they did actually reach the col, and they did very, very clearly that was a very viable route.
Okay, so we're just going to take a moment to play a clip from our online exhibition, everest1921.com. It is a reading by the actor John McGlynn of George Leigh Mallory's account of being on the North Col in 1921, and it comes from the official narrative of the expedition, which was published the following year.
But what lay ahead of us? My eyes had often strayed as we came up to the rounded edge above the col and the final rocks below the northeast arête. If ever we had doubted whether the arête were accessible, it was impossible to doubt any longer. For a long way up those easy rock and snow slopes was neither danger nor difficulty. But at present there was wind. Even where we stood under the lee of a little ice cliff, it came in fierce gusts at frequent intervals, blowing up the powdery snow in a suffocating tourbillon. On the col beyond it was blowing a gale, and higher was a more fearful sight. The powdery fresh snow on the great face of Everest was being swept along in unbroken spindrift, and the very ridge where our route lay was marked out to receive its unmitigated fury. We could see the blown snow deflected upwards for a moment where the wind met the ridge, only to rush violently down in a frightful blizzard on the leeward side. To see, in fact, was enough. The wind had settled the question. It would have been folly to go on. Nevertheless, some little discussion took place as to what might be possible, and we struggled a few steps further to put the matter to the test. For a few moments we exposed ourselves on the col to feel the full strength of the blast, then struggled back to shelter.
Okay, so this attempt on the North Col marks the culmination of the expedition. Even though they continued to map for many weeks thereafter, they've fulfilled their primary goal of finding a route to the summit of Everest. But I just want to jump forward briefly and discuss your own experiences, Frank, because you've been on the North Col many times, and you could give listeners an example of what it's like to be there.
Well, when you're going from the top of the Rongbuk Glacier is about 20,000 feet, So it's roughly speaking a 3,000 foot climb onto the North Col, And that's the first time I did it from the main Rongbuk Glacier with Phil Thomas. And it was about a 6-hour climb. But you got to remember, it was sort of soft, heavy snow, carrying everything that you needed, rope, climbing gear, sleeping bags, mattresses, all that, and food, in a tent. So, it's heavy carry for just two people. And when we got ourselves onto the col, and then, of course, it snowed all night and the next day. And so we ended up descending down the other side, which was the side which Mallory and Wheeler took back in 1920, and which became the way. But we descended, my first time I descended down that, the first time I went down that way. And in 87, and then I came back a week later and climbed it again from the main Rongbuk Glacier. But on the Everest expedition, I climbed onto the North Col, I think it was 6 times from the top of that glacier. And that was part of toing and froing until we got the opportunity to go for the summit. And eventually from there, myself and Dawson got the camps 2 and 3, and then had an assault on Everest on the 27th of May in 1993. And I got up on to the second step, to the foot of the second step. And from there, I'd run out of oxygen, but Dawson managed to get from there to the summit. And we made the first Irish descent of Everest. So I'm very familiar with the North Col.
Fair enough. It was like a second home to you at that stage. But I suppose, Frank, now we need to move off the North Col. It's nearing the end of the expedition. And can you explain the reconnaissance team's successes and their achievements?
The expedition was absolutely 100% successful. They did everything we were sent out to do. The map was an astonishing piece of work. Howard Bury and Wheeler did a huge amount of work. When the expedition proper was finished, Howard Bury walked into Macaloo with Wheeler, and they took additional photographs, and they spent extra days up there just to complete the circle, to get pictures of the Kangshung Glacier. And they went right up the fourth highest mountain in the world, Macaloo. They went right up into the base of that. They also, in the process, they had discovered the worthiness of the Sherpa. As all subsequent expeditions have used the Nepali Sherpa as people who live in the Solo Khumbu area in Nepal. They've used those as mountain guides. They completed the maps of Sikkim and the approach map. So all subsequent expeditions have used that approach route in. Wheeler found a way from the Rongbuk Monastery up the Rongbuk Glacier, and then turning left into the East Rongbuk Glacier. The expedition came over the Larkville Pass, but his research found a better way to get to the same place. And so all subsequent expeditions used that. They did a complete appraisal of the plant life, and their reports on flora and fauna were outstanding.
Of course, while the expedition was ongoing, newspapers all over the world, in Ireland, Britain, Europe, United States, I've seen Australian newspapers following the expedition, they all kept up to date with what was happening. And that meant that when Howard Bury and his team arrived back in Europe, they found that they were international celebrities. And Howard Bury ended up getting a special award from the Royal Geographical Society, the Founders Medal, which is handed out once a year. Could you explain the significance of that to us, Frank?
Well, the Founders Medal, if you look at who the other recipients of it were, like Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian who reached the South Pole, the RGS awarded it to him. They had previously awarded it to Captain Scott on one of his earlier expeditions. Now, because I suppose Shackleton was one of Scott's rivals, they never actually awarded the Founders Medal to, because I suppose the people that were promoting Scott would have seen Shackleton as a rival. So, remarkably, Shackleton never received it. But also remarkably, it's Shackleton's statue that stands outside the RGS, with Livingston at the front and Shackleton at the back. So, you can sort of see. But you also had David Livingston received it, and Irish recipients would have included Leopold McClintock, who discovered what happened to the Franklin expedition. And we had, Robert McClure from Wexford, who made the first Northwest Passage coming through from the Bering Strait and making his way overland on various ships. He made his way back into the Atlantic. He actually was awarded it for that journey. So, to be listed with those sort of people was, that's who you're being listed with. And indeed, Edmund Hillary, when he made the first ascent of Everest, he was awarded the Founders Medal as well. If you look at Thor Heyerdahl, got it for, these are names of, So in his time, Howard Bury was considered, well up there.
Frank, I'd like to thank you for appearing on the latest episode of our podcast series. There'll be more episodes in forthcoming weeks. Again, this episode is related to our online exhibition created by myself on behalf of Belvedere House and Gardens and Westmeath County Council. It's at everest1921.com. That's www.everest1921.com. It's got many photos from Tibet in 1921. Howard Bury was a superb photographer, as well as photos from his 1913 expedition to the Tian Shan Mountains, which was an incredible trip in its own right. And many of these are stored in Mullingar Public Library. So that link again, everest1921.com. Thank you.